meeting for new projects. But this is the opportunity to probably give the longest version and also a version where everybody can ask questions. We have a total of 2 hours. We don't have that many slides, so there really should be plenty of time for your questions. We will actually break the presentation at 3, or we will have opportunities for 3 questions. Once after slide 19, then that is basically mostly the template and some general introductions. Then after slide 21, that is on the status of recruitment sites. And then at the end, that will be after the section on the financial issues. The most important error on this first slide, which is my fault, is that it only gives my name. But as Constanze just said, there are in fact 3 of us here. I will start, and then Laszlo. Then I come back for 3 slides, and then Mila will give the presentation on the financial issues. So again, welcome everybody, and thank you to HNN 2.0 for the opportunity to discuss clinical trials, clinical studies in this context. So trying to move the first slide. Yes. So we structured our presentation in 5 parts. We start with a short introduction on the general context. Then we have a longer section on the template that we use in the proposal forms. Then we have something on the deliverables. Then a 3 slides on the administrative status of recruitment sites. And then the last part on the financial issues. So why do we fund clinical studies? Well, hopefully evident to most or all of you, because they bring innovations to patients and markets, because they provide evidence to impact and change clinical practice and improve patient care, because it's very important at the EU level to reach a critical mass. Particular examples are rare diseases, where you very often cannot do it on the national level, or also these increasingly stratified approaches where patient groups just get too small to limit studies to only one member state. We can maximize recruitment through EU or international collaboration. We can also, through a bigger participation, increase the robustness of data, of course, and we need multidisciplinary expertise. So that's all good reasons to fund clinical studies at the EU level. What do we fund? Well, basically the answer is really virtually everything. We have tried to put together on this slide a number of different studies and trials, and there's actually examples for all of this in Horizon 2020 and already in FP7. So we study hypothesis generating epidemiology studies, but also hypothesis testing trials. You will notice that we use throughout the presentations mostly the term clinical studies. I'll come to that. That's because in general, most of what we say applies to the very broad universe of clinical studies and not only to the more targeted and more specific term of clinical trials. We fund trials on medical devices, on companion diagnostics, on surgery, radiotherapy, other non-pharmacological interventions. We also fund pharmaceutical trials from phase 1 to phase 4, and also including observational studies. And then, of course, we fund studies on all areas of disease, rare diseases, non-communicable diseases, infectious diseases, injuries, and any other questions of health status. And we fund also trials that take into account special populations, adults most frequently, but also certainly children, elderly, and that take appropriate consideration of gender issues. This is trying to give you an overview of why this is so important to us, simply because we are increasing the number of projects that include some element of clinical studies. So here we tried, in the big figure, we tried to give you an overview of what we have done in FP7. More than 340,000 patients have recruited into EU-funded clinical studies, 165 projects, 286 trials. So that's because we actually have more. There are several projects that have more than one trial in them, and with a total funding of 1.1 billion. So that's a huge amount of money, which also deserves, of course, a lot of attention into giving the best administrative, legal, and financial context to these studies as possible. And then you see that in Horizon 2020, if anything, this number has even increased, and we're funding more than 50% of our projects in Societal Challenge 1 include clinical studies. So we start with the definition. A clinical study in this context here of the template and also of the financial considerations is any clinical research involving a substantial amount of work related to the observation of, data collection from, or diagnostic or therapeutic intervention on multiple or individual patients or study subjects. It includes, but is not limited to, clinical studies and clinical trials in the sense of the EU Clinical Trials Directive or the new regulation. So it's a broad, inclusive definition. The take-home message is, in general, don't worry about whether what you're doing is a clinical study or a clinical trial. If it is at all useful for you, then most likely what we say here, or basically what we say here, will apply to your clinical study. Not something that is crucial whether you actually fit exactly into that definition. You can use the options and the services that we present here. So we will start with the template that we have developed now a number of years ago, I believe either at the beginning of FP7 or maybe already at the end of FP6. We developed this specific template because we realized that we very often, evaluators did not have all the information in one structured overview, key information on the clinical study, and also because we realized that applicants sometimes had difficulty fitting some information that is important for clinical studies into our page limit. So those were the two triggers for us to provide this template. It provides structured information to the experts for the evaluation, and it gives applicants the chance to provide detailed information where needed about the clinical studies without page limitations. It also provides the necessary information to request unit costs, and we ask it to be mandatory for certain single stage and second stage topics that are listed in the template itself. And you see below in the footnote, the template will be available afterwards, the direct link to the template. You can also see it in each of our call topics that are open now. You see somewhere at the bottom under other call documents, you can find a link to a PDF of the template. Even if it doesn't apply to this topic, you still have the link where you can find the template under any topic. But importantly, it is not an eligibility criterion. If you provide the information in other part of the proposal, you will not be excluded with your proposal. But the message here is really use this template. It is useful for you and the evaluators. Whenever something doesn't apply, we come to that in the next slide, then just give a short explanation why it doesn't apply, and that's fine, but really use this template. So it is an opportunity for structured information. We are very likely going to have questions like, should I use this template or should I not? The general message is yes, you should use the template if at all possible. So of course, when I say mandatory for certain topics, then we have chosen topics that in our opinion are very likely to include clinical studies. But if it so happens that under one topic you submit something that doesn't include a clinical study, then obviously you do not have to use the template. But voila. Last general introduction on the template. Due to the heterogeneity of clinical studies, the very broad and inclusive definition, not necessarily all sections of the template will be applicable to your particular study. Therefore, we ask you to complete all relevant sections that are requested and a short justification if you think that a particular section of the template doesn't apply to your study. Just say, doesn't apply because we don't have a randomized intervention or something like this. You will see this in more detail later. And the second very, very strong message that will hopefully come along while we talk about the template, but this is a major concern to us, the operational feasibility of the clinical study has to be demonstrated in your proposal. Proposal evaluation scoring is negatively affected by overly optimistic timelines and by unrealistic planning in any aspect. So you have bigger chances with your proposal if you give all the information that convinces the evaluators that you can do what you promise, in particular in terms of patient recruitment, and it does not serve you to promise the moon if you can't deliver it afterwards. So this is really, really important to us, and wherever possible, give us the evidence that you can do this. One more general introduction slide. So what is not part of the template but is to be addressed in the respective section of the view of the general proposal template are the ethical considerations. There's a whole ethics section in the general proposal template, and that's where you should provide information about all your ethics considerations in the study. And there's also a specific section on risk and contingency plans, where you generally should put all your risk and contingency plans. And again, one very important message: if you do not outline your contingency plans in the proposal, and you cannot proceed as you planned with your study, then there's a possibility that we might terminate the grant agreement, because we are under much pressure to not give project extensions. So significantly delayed study milestones, like, for example, the enrollment of the first patient, might lead to the termination of the grant agreement. Again, a reminder, please be realistic in your planning from the beginning. This is really, really important. And with that, I hand over to my colleague Laszlo Helmle, who will guide you through the template. And then at the end of that section, we will have time for questions.
Thank you, Cornelius, and good morning from my side to everyone as well. We will go through the template, but not in the very fine details. Just I will give you the main sections, and I try to highlight the key information that we would like to invite applicants to put information on into the template. This is really, as Cornelius mentioned, is a tool to provide structured information for the evaluators, and also an opportunity for the applicants to give as many information as they want that are relevant for the project without any page limitations. So obviously we need a study identifier, and for pharmaceutical studies this could be the number that is given when an applicant registers on the EU clinical trial database. This is automatically generated. This is just an example for pharmaceutical studies. And then we go into the more descriptive parts, like study design and endpoints. We'd like the applicants to provide us a brief description of the objectives or hypotheses and concise description of the selected study design. It's also important to explain in the primary and secondary endpoints outcome measures description how the patient relevant priorities are taken into consideration when the design was drawn up. Basically, what we mean here is that we'd like the applicants to involve patient associations when they draw their plans about the clinical studies. It's really important to have their input into the design, because then the generalizability of the clinical study outcome and the relevance for the patients are much more ensured in this way. Obviously, for scientific excellence, we'd like to see that the applicants have reached out to all the applicable and available scientific guidances, be it on the methodological perspectives or in the general sense of quality, like good clinical practice for pharmaceutical development projects. But there are a lot out there, and I really like to take this opportunity to draw the attention of applicants to search for the current available high-level scientific guidelines, because this is one area where evaluators will look into how contemporaneous this project proposal is in terms of clinical study design. Now, if we move to the other section, which is the regulatory status and activities, we'd like to have a clear understanding whether the project involves a clinical study which falls into the regulation, or currently the clinical trial directive if it's a pharmaceutical development, or if it's a medical device, whether it's being taken under the current legal framework or after 2020 about the new regulation. And obviously there are other type of interventions where we also invite applicants to fill in this template that do not fall either under the pharmaceutical development or medical device development area, but still the template gives opportunity, and it's also can be applied for other type of human interventions. There is also scientific advice protocol assistance available from EMA. I have to say that this also involves a considerable cost element if the pharmaceutical under question is not a product for a rare disease. If it's a rare disease medication, then the fee is not applied, but in all other circumstances, unfortunately, the fee applies, and then it has to be paid if this scientific advice protocol assistance is thought for. There is also qualification advice available from the EMA, and this is more applicable to pharmaceutical developments where a new methodology is planned to be applied. For example, use of a biomarker, a new biomarker that has not been widely used in previous clinical research activities. Now going into the next section, subject populations. We'd like to see at this stage of applications, what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and if there is a specific patient population that is excluded from the trial, we would also like to see some justification about that. Also, the same request goes to special populations, children and elderly. If they are in part of the study, we would like to see the justification for these populations. If in the statistical analysis, sub-analysis of certain subpopulations are planned, we'd also like to see the clear definition of these subpopulations at this section. And now it leads into our next headline, which is the statistical analysis planning and power calculation. As you know, this is pretty much a key element in terms of how feasible the project will be from the operational perspective. Recruitment of subjects are burdensome, and sometimes it really hinders a successful implementation of a project which involves clinical studies. So please pay attention to this calculation, also not jeopardizing the scientific validity of the outcome, because the necessary sample size has to be there, justified by the right methodologies applied from the statistical terms. In the next section, 1.6, cumulative safety and efficacy information. It is very important to see whether the next proposed development phase of any type of human intervention is justified from previous clinical information that is gathered, or if it's a first-in-human trial, obviously from all the preclinical studies that are required from the regulatory perspective are there to support this initiative. It's very easy for pharmaceutical developments, because if it's a phase 1, 2, or 3 studies, it's the relevant section of the so-called Investigational Medicinal Product Dossier, or IMPD, or if it's a phase 4 study in pharmaceuticals, which means that the investigational medicinal product is used according to the current labeling in that particular country, in which case the summary of product characteristics, or SMPC, relevant sections might be used. And the same thing goes for the efficacy part. Next section is the overall conduct of the study, we like to see a very robust planning where we see that all major obstacles are planned in a way that it takes into account all the usual problematic points of the execution of the clinical trials. And so, as Cornelius mentioned, it is really all the information that gives the idea to the evaluator that it is really based on a realistic planning and operational feasibility is justified and highly and demonstrated at a high level. So it includes obviously the timing, how timing is planned for the execution, number of when the first subject is planned to be enrolled into the study, the last patient enrolled, and the last patient who completed the actual study is part of this timeline planning. And obviously, it ends with the time point when the clinical study report is available to make it available for the scientific community. Now here goes a very important element, which is the description of the recruitment strategy of the study population. Obviously, it doesn't happen quite frequently that we have documented information about previous study enrollment which targeted the same or very similar patient population, but that is ideal. So if the applicant has taken part in previous studies that targeted very similar patient populations, we'd like to see the time frames of that previous activities, because that would give us more reassuring information that the projected timelines are pretty feasible and operationally possible. Now, every study is quite different, and patient willingness to consent for voluntary participation can change. So we'd also like to see appropriate contingency measures that will make up the times lost or the number of patients not being able to enroll in a manner which will not jeopardize the scientific validity of the trial. So we'd like to see a complex approach when these contingency measures are drawn up. We'd like to see all the technical parts of the control measures that would like to avoid biases. So methods for allocation of different interventions and blinding procedures, these already have to be presented when the application is provided under this section of the template. And for overall study management, study monitoring, data and biological sample management provisions have to be provided in this section as well. And we also like to draw attention to the appropriate control measures that will ensure that appropriate adverse event collection and reporting takes place during the study execution. Still under this section, under the conduct section, we'd like to see the roles and responsibilities of certain bodies that are set up to oversee the conduct of the study. We'd like to see the list of entities that take up a special or specific role during the conduct of the study, and a description of what they are charged with. If the interventions involve a pharmaceutical, it is very important to see that arrangements have been secured for all the manufacturing and labeling perspectives of these pharmaceuticals. It is the preparation of the study medications, if it's not a phase 4 clinical study, has to be taken into consideration all the GMP perspectives that are relevant for the manufacturing and labeling of these medications. And it's quite a complex issue, so we'd like to see upfront the appropriate arrangements that are made around these issues. Clinical centers who will be involved in recruiting the right patient population is also an important aspect. Applicants at the time of submission might not know exactly the sites, but at least we'd like to see the selection criteria for the sites and how they are going to be chosen and whether they are appropriate in terms of number, and whether there is also a contingency plan which relates to the appropriate requirements. And I'll finish with my part of the presentation with the last section, which is titled Orphan Designation. So, as I have mentioned previously, if we have an orphan designation from the European Commission, and so this intervention is studied in the project, then the protocol assistance could be thought for, and the administrative fee does not have to be paid in this perspective. And now with this one, I'd like to give it back to Cornelius, who will continue with the rest of the presentation.
Okay, I still have 3 slides before we start with the first section on question. Those 3 slides relate to the deliverables that we would like you to include in your proposal. Now, if you don't include these deliverables in your proposal, it is not ultimately a drama. We will be able to do this if you are successful. We will be able to do this during the gap phase. But of course, the idea is that your proposal is already as close as possible to the final, to the project as implemented. And therefore, we ask you, if possible, to include this. These are mandatory deliverables for clinical studies. The first one we call First Study Subject Approvals Package, which should include 3 things: the final version of the study protocol as it is submitted to the regulators and ethics committee. So this happens not in the proposal. All we want in the proposal, you just include this as a deliverable, timed at, I don't know, month 2, month 3, month 6, sometime early during your clinical study when you have the study protocol ready. The registration number of the clinical study in a WHO or International Committee of Medical Journal Editors approved registry that allows result posting, very importantly. That will be in the future the case of all these approved registries, but it is currently not yet the case. And the first approvals from the ethics committees and the national competent authorities, if applicable, for the invitation or enrollment of the first subject in at least 1 clinical center. So that's the first study subject approvals package that we ask you to put into your proposal. The second one is the midterm recruitment report, very important, which is which you should time at the point when you think that you will have recruited 50% of the study population of your study. And then you should simply submit to us a brief report at that time point, giving an overview of the recruited subjects by study site, potential recruiting problems, and if you're late, then you need at that point give us a detailed and realistic plan on how you're going to catch up. So that needs to be in every proposal and eventually also in every project. And the last mandatory deliverable is one at the end of the project. We ask you to include something on where you are with posting results in the study registries. Posting summary results, so this is not about any raw data or raw patient data, it's a summary of your results, is mandatory in these, is mandatory for you in the registry. We realize that very often, unfortunately, by the end of our funding, the trial is not completely finished yet, so you cannot post the results. If you have done that, all the better, then just tell us that you have done it. If you haven't done yet, or you can't do it yet, then that this is an awareness raising exercise to remind you, you are absolutely obliged to do this, and you should tell us an indicative time point of when you will post the study results so that we can at a later time point verify this. It needs to be within 12 months of primary study completion. That is also already in our work program, and that's an obligation for everybody who gets funding from us. Okay, so this would be the end of this first section. I see that there are some questions. Constanze, I don't know, do you want to read the questions and then I answer, or should I go through them? How are we doing this?
We can do it, or that's how we thought we could do it. So I can read the questions and then you will just, give the answers. And
okay.
So I think we can start with the first one. It's quite a long one. It's regarding point 1.7 conduct. So the question is, could you give an advice on how much time applicants should calculate for project continuation after last patient completed the study? So from our experience, people usually tend to plan the end of the project with the last patient who completed the study. We always remind them that still data need to be analyzed, etc. So how much additional time might be justified?
Well, actually, the usual internationally accepted time frame goes until 1 year after the last subject completed the study. So that should give ample time for data cleaning activities and statistical analysis and report writing. So usually that's the maximum time frame that is accepted for at an international standard.
Okay, thank you. So the second question, it's about clinical centers. Is it possible to involve new clinical centers observing the criteria listed in section 1.7 as the study goes on, or should the list of clinical centers be fixed at the proposal stage?
Well, I'll start, and then Mila might also come in on that. Well, actually, that touches, can we answer that maybe after the next set of slides? Because the next set of slides are about the recruitment center. So let's answer that after the next section.
Sure, we will just put it down here so that we know that we don't forget about this question. And then the next question is, where can this template be found?
Yes, the direct link is on slide number 7 in the footnote. There you have the direct link, but you can also see it under any topic that is currently open for Societal Challenge 1 in the participant portal. I believe it's relatively at the bottom. I can't no absolute guarantee for that, but it is in each for each topic of Societal Challenge 1 you can find a link to this template for clinical studies, and the direct link is in slide number 7, and the slides will be made available.
Okay, great, thank you. And then again, the template, should it be used for all clinical studies or only if it's specified in the call?
It can only be, so this is, it can only be submitted in the submission system for those topics for which we have listed it. So we have, let's say, we have a total of 50 topics. We consider, this is an imaginary number, we consider that in 25 of these topics, there's a reasonable chance that clinical trials are included. For these 25, we say it is mandatory, and only for these 25 is it possible to actually submit the template as a separate document as part of the submission system. If you have a clinical trial in one of these studies, in one of these topics, then yes, definitely use it. If you happen to do a clinical study in a topic where the template isn't foreseen to be submitted, which should be a rare exception, but it could be, then you can unfortunately not submit the template itself, but you can still absolutely use the structure of the template to structure your information in the general proposal, along the same lines. I hope that was clear.
Yes, thank you. So the next question is, are there any specific rules for retrospective studies?
No, so generally the same, I mean, For retrospective studies, you need, of course, to be sure that you have consent to use the data that you want to use, but to the extent possible, just use the same template and complete the sections that apply. And for those that don't apply, there are obviously some that don't apply, say this doesn't apply because it is a retrospective study and because the intervention has already been done, or whatever you need to put there.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, is there any Horizon 2020 financing instrument dedicated just to clinical studies?
So that depends on your definition of financing instruments. We will come to that in the third section. There are a few specific ways you can claim your costs for clinical studies, but there's no extra specific funding instrument.
Okay. And what about the clinical evaluation report of the clinical study? Should we add it in the final deliverables?
Not 100% sure what you mean with the clinical evaluation report. If you mean the clinical study report, then that is, I don't know, Laszlo, can you help with that question? So what about the clinical evaluation report of the clinical study? Should we add it in the final deliverables?
No, actually, we just have to see that this is done or process as a deliverable.
Okay.
But not necessarily the whole report.
Correct. So that to the extent that it refers to the results posting that I mentioned in the last deliverable, yes, we want evidence that either you have already submitted the summary publicly available information or that you will do it. To the extent that it refers to other more detailed and maybe with more personal data clinical study clinical evaluation reports, then you don't need to necessarily include that as a deliverable. That is not something that you need to submit to us.
Okay. The next question is regarding ethical approvals. Must the clinical study be approved in all countries participating in the clinical study, or only in the country of the coordinator?
Well, this really is very important that somebody who applies for a clinical study is able to be answered to that question himself, him or herself, I have to say, because that is so much basics of regulatory approval that this is something that the expertise needs to be in the consortium. So yes, very clearly, the answer here is according to the current, depends on what study you do, and so for example, for studies on medicinal products, on drugs, this is regulated at the EU level, and there very clearly it must be approved in all countries in which you enroll patients. I believe that that should also be the case for all other studies, but there the regulation, for example, for surgical studies is entirely at the member state level, but I would be very surprised if any member states lets anybody carry out studies on its territory that are not approved by an ethics committee on the...
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. And what are the experiences with the open research data pilot and projects with clinical studies?
Good question and difficult question, because it is very clear that the open research data pilot does not apply to personal data, so we do not have a good solution on how to make available individual patient data, raw patient data. Those do not fall under the open research data pilot. To the extent that data are aggregated and anonymized, we want them, of course, to be made available openly, but the question is a rich data set, to what extent can that data set still be anonymous? So that's a difficult question. Independent of all what I've said, the most important thing that remains on openness is the results posting. So this is clearly the very minimum obligation that everybody needs to comply with in the registry, but that's at a very aggregated data level, the summary. For more individual patient data, we don't have a good solution at the moment.
Great.
Are we done?
The next question is again on ethical approvals. Must they be obtained before proposal submission, or can they be submitted after the project starts?
No, because we realize that that is a very it's wonderful if you can do it before. That's great, and that will definitely lend credibility and success chances to your study. But we realize that in many cases you cannot start this very laborsome work before you know that your study is being financed. So therefore, it is possible to do this afterwards. Therefore, we want it as a deliverable and not as not already in the proposal. I mean, we just want the deliverable itself, the notion of the deliverable in the proposal, but not the actual approvals.
Great. So I think this was the last question for now.
Okay.
So thank you for answering all the questions. And I think there are no other questions, and I see no one typing, so I think we can go on with the presentation.
Great. I will just do the next 3 slides, and then I'll have Mila help me answer the questions on that one, because that is on the administrative status of recruitment sites. So clinical centers whose contribution is limited to subject recruitment or treatment may have a status of. They can always be full beneficiary. That's, according to our rules, always possible and is actually our preferred solution. But of course, if you have 100 participating centers, that becomes a little bit unmanageable or unwieldy, and that's why we have to provide 2 other options. One is the use of in-kind contributions provided by third parties against payment. That's because we consider patient data as an in-kind contribution in this case, or as subcontractors. Those are the Articles 11 and 13 of the Model Grant Agreement. Very important that it is not possible to reimburse recruitment sites based on Article 10 of the Model Grant Agreement, so purchase of goods, works, or services is not possible for recruitment sites. The first option, the use of in-kind contributions provided by third parties against payment, has certain implications. It means that these third parties must be identified in the description of action. So if you have a doubt and you don't know yet whether a third party will participate or not, better to include it, because it doesn't hurt at all if you have a site in your description of action that at the end will not need any reimbursement. That is not a problem. Whereas if you have a site that you didn't have at the beginning, then it's less than ideal. There is a possibility to also reimburse them if they are not mentioned in the description of action, but the general rule is include everybody who you think should be included in the description of action. Very importantly, these sites need to be reimbursed and need to claim their costs according to the same rules as the beneficiary. So it must be no profit, and we can only reimburse actual costs or unit costs. So not any agreed lump sum or price, or this. All this does not work. It requires a prior agreement with the beneficiary, but that can be prior to the start of the work and not necessarily prior to signature of the grant agreement. This agreement might also be ad hoc, specific to the project, and the 25% indirect costs can be claimed by the third party itself, but not by the beneficiary when actual or unit costs are used. And the last option is the second option, alternative option, is that of subcontractor. There, only the task should be identified in the description of action. So what do you expect of these recruitment centers? In fact, it usually makes us suspicious if you already mention which centers are participating, because these, if you do it as subcontractors, they must be chosen according to the best price quality ratio in accordance with the rules of transparency and equal treatment. We realize that that is not at the first sight very obvious, for that's not how in practice currently most clinical trial centers are included in projects. But we also think that is actually not impossible to do. So discuss this with your procurement unit or with the colleagues in the administration that are responsible for this, because we think it can be done. In this case, the advantage is that you can actually agree on a price per patient subject. Profit is theoretically possible, even though probably in reality it doesn't happen very often, but it is possible, and we do not need any detailed cost documentation from these centers. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage or the downside or the consequence of that is that you need to demonstrate that you have applied the ratio of the quality, the principles of transparency and equal treatment. And for public bodies, that means that the internal rules and the applicable legislation related to public procurement is used. And in this case, there are no indirect costs for the beneficiary, but since we now have a 100% reimbursement rate in Horizon 2020, there's not really any more a shortfall for the linked beneficiary. It's actually an old part in this slide that still goes back to the transition from FP7, where we had the 75% reimbursement rate, where the lack of the indirect cost was a bigger problem. That is all the slides on the recruitment sides. Any questions on this one? So maybe I let well, there was the question, is it possible to involve new clinical centers involving the criteria listed in section 1.7 of the template as the study goes on, or should the list of clinical centers be fixed at the proposal stage? Maybe I'll let Mila directly answer to that question.
Hello, good morning. First, I will answer to the question. In fact, it is possible to add these centers, but I think you have to explain in the proposal from the beginning which are your possibilities, and if you have already as much as centers identified and ready to participate in the study, the proposal is more realistic than if you have an hypothetical participation of centers. This is the first thing. But if in the course of the project we have to add one center of the other, this is not a problem. We will add the center, but you cannot base a proposal only in a hypothetical centers that are going to be added afterwards in the middle of the project. So we continue with the unit cost for the clinical studies. In fact, this is an alternative to the use of actual cost. Is in a voluntary basis. Why we started to think about this unit cost for clinical studies is because we realized that this is very difficult to calculate, not to calculate, to prove the resources used in a clinical study. Is not a question of the cost. The costs are not so difficult to identify, the hourly rate, for example, or how much the consumables cost, because everything is in the books of the entity. But what is to identify which are the resources consumed. It's not difficult, but it's cumbersome. This is a word, cumbersome, because, for example, all the personnel working in a clinical study, if you go to actual cost, have to fulfill timesheets, which is not very easy. If you have nurses, for example, in a blood test, working 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there with this patient, half an hour there. So we understand that this was difficult. This is because we started to think about another methodology and how the financial regulation that is in place could help us. So we identified this way of doing, which is the unit cost for the clinical trials, and we have a commission decision describing which is this methodology. Okay, so it is calculated according to a fixed methodology, which is in this commission decision, and is not the beneficiary's own methodology. The commission says how to calculate this, and then you provide, and we will see at the end the table in the proposal. Normally, it's requested in the proposal, and the calculation is evaluated by the expert. More than the calculation method, and I will correct this in this slide, is the resources that are going to be used are evaluated by the experts. And why unit cost? I have already said, no need to prove the use of resources. So timesheets or all other, for example, in the machine, we should be able to prove also timesheets for the machine, how much, how long the machine has been used for a patient or another. And then, which is the advantage also with this, is that only the number of patients enrolled and the correctness of the historical cost listed will be audited. It can be used by the beneficiaries, by linked third parties, and also by third parties contributing in kind to the clinical study for all their actions under the work program health. Normally should be included in the proposal. The expert will evaluate it, and then is in the grant agreement. But it is true that in the course of the grant agreement, in the course of the project, we can amend the grant agreement for two things. One, and this is a flexible interpretation, but we have interpreted like this. We can change the choice. We can say, the beneficiaries can say, I wanted to go for actual cost when presented the proposal, or we did not have the time to all the calculations when we presented the proposal, but now we are ready and we want to present an amendment and go for the unit cost. We will accept this. There's another thing, and is we have a unit cost in the grant agreement, but we want to change the unit cost. So why? Because we have changed the protocol, or we have realized that there is an error in the calculation, in the cost, for example, in the error rate, in the hourly rate. So for these things, we will accept an amendment. We will evaluate, of course, in the commission if the amendment is acceptable. One thing that you have to, all the methodology is very well explained in the commission decision, but I wanted to point out one thing for personal cost, is that we have only 3 categories of personnel, and all the personnel that who is working on the project has to fit in these categories. We have doctors, other medical personnel, and technical personnel. We cannot invent another category. Okay, then we have this tip, what we call the magic 3 numbers, that could be very useful if you know that you are going to participate in several proposals. You can ask your accounting department of the institution to have the average hourly rates for the year, for each year, and when you present a proposal you already know this, and this is very useful because you have already the calculation. Another thing that we realize, and we will accept this also, is that sometimes what we call the sequential unit cost for clinical studies. Okay, so because the unit cost can only be claimed in principle for a patient that have completed the entire study task, except if we have built sequential unit cost. So we can divide the study in several phases. And for each of the phases we will have a unit cost. We cannot divide it into 100 phases, but 3 phases or whatever that is logical we can accept also. The proposal, or if you ask for an amendment, will describe what is needed for the clinical study, the resources, identical, this is very important, has to be identical for each center. The beneficiary and third party wishing to use the unit cost have to list these resources. The choice, which is very important, is neutral for the evaluation. There are no advantages for people, for beneficiaries that are, or for projects that are applying for the unit cost. They do not have extra points for this. And if they ask for and it is incorrect, it's not penalized either. And this is, I think, this is the best way to explain how it works, the unit cost. So in the evaluation, or if you ask for an amendment, you have to attach this table, and in this table we have to see for each task that is going to be performed in the clinical trial the resources. So for example, you see here for blood sample, you have to identify which will be the resources needed in terms of personnel, for example, in terms of doctors, normally they are not, other medical personnel, technical personnel, and then consumables, for example, syringe, cannula, blood container. So here in the example, you will see that we have which are the resources that we need. For example, we need 10 minutes of a nurse for doing this, so we put it in other medical personnel, and then we have another column that we have the cost of this. So this is because we said we have to know the hourly rate for this other medical personnel, and we will use it here to calculate how much is it for this particular task. Okay. At the end of you have other tasks, all the tasks needed for a scanner, for example, or whatever, and at the end we will get a cost per patient and per beneficiary. Why per beneficiary? Because although the resources to be used have to be the same for each beneficiary, so 10 minutes of nurse is the same wherever it is done, or how much syringe or cannula is the same for each participant, for each beneficiary. The cost of the hourly rate or the cost of the consumable, the unit of the consumables, is not the same. Will not be the same for each beneficiary, for each entity. So this is because at the end we will have a different unit cost per beneficiary. I think this will help a lot, really, to demonstrate the cost in a project. And the big advantage is that if you have an audit, the only thing that we are going to verify, well, as we said, is the number of patients, and if the cost, this hourly rate, this unit cost per cannula, for example, is the one that is well calculated according to the methodology that is in the commission decision and is in the books of the company. But you don't have to demonstrate how many cannulas, how many consumables, how long, you don't have to demonstrate it. You don't have to prove the time spent by the personnel, which is the most important, the most difficult. Time spent by the personnel in the trial, or the time of use of an scanner that is already in this form and has already been assessed by the experts. So now we are ready for the questions.
Okay. Thank you. And hello.
Okay. Sorry. No, I wanted maybe it's better if I finished. Sorry, because I wanted only to present you another thing that I forgot. It's the unit cost for internally invoiced goods or services. It's another unit cost. It's new in the last version of the model grant agreement, and this unit cost is different from the unit cost for clinical trials. It's a unit cost that is calculated according to the accounts of the beneficiary. But this unit cost normally is not per patient. It's, for example, you can have this for the use of a scanner. This can be, or for example, for an animal housing. We have a lot of examples of this in our project, people that have animal housings, and then they calculate the cost per mouse, for example, and this we can accept. We can accept this, the unit cost for these kind of things, if the company, if the entity, the beneficiary, has already a methodology to calculate this cost. The methodology has to be in place, and this methodology has to reflect cost, cannot reflect any profit. And this you have to be very careful, because we know that in most of the hospitals they have a sort of fee, even internal, for doing a test among department, and does not mean that this will be always acceptable, because we have seen that in most of the cases there are elements inside this unit cost that are not eligible. So this methodology, if these costs are in there, or there's a margin of profit, or it cannot be demonstrated that it's only based on cost, is not acceptable. So use accounting practices, no ineligible cost inside, and I know that you can have doubts on this. We have an example for a scanner here with the number of costs that can be eligible, and you can rate this, and a number of costs that cannot be eligible. But if you want to be sure, what we can do, what you can do is to ask a sort of certificate to the commission, to present beforehand your methodology, and to ask if this methodology is acceptable. The advantages for me personally of the unit cost for the clinical trial is that once we have approved it from the beginning, we are not going to go to audit anymore the method, because the method is the method of the commission. So The only thing we are going to audit, and I repeat it several times because it's important, is the number of patients and only if the costs are well recorded in the books. Okay? So thank you very much, and now we'll go for the questions.
Thank you for your presentation. And we have a couple of questions here already. So I think we can just start with the first one, which is which type of selection we have to do for the selection of the clinical centers. So in case we have considered their subcontractors. Best price, is it possible to provide a best price when we have recruitment of patients? Or can we do a selection based on other factors?
Of course, it's not the when we say price, is not the price the key element. The price is one of the elements of the selection. For example, if you have several centers doing the same, of course, and you are going to choose only one, you have to choose the one that has the best price. Then, of course, you are going to choose first of all the best quality. But this should be in the notice, and this should be very clear, because one of the elements, the most important element of the procedure for subcontracting is the transparency. So if it is very clear when you launch the procedure that the quality is the element that is going to be more weight in the selection, this has to be there, and the criteria for which is quality should be there also. So it's not price the best, the first criteria, of course not, but it depends. It depends if you have several centers. Maybe you are going to accept all the centers, so the price won't be either selection criteria. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, in French hospitals, unit costs for clinical trials are often not based on historical costs of a given beneficiary, because they are fixed costs based on a methodology established at national level by our national security system. Is this national methodology recognized by the EC, and can those costs be considered eligible?
Okay, first, there's a difference again between the two methodologies. One thing is the unit cost per patient that we have for the unit cost of clinical trials, that is the commission methodology, and you follow this, and our experts are going to evaluate and bless. And another thing is what they say, that is more the second part of my presentation was the unit cost, the internal invoice. This is what we can say that the French system fits into this. The only thing that we have to be sure is that the unit costs they have determined in France do not have any element inside the methodology that can be ineligible. So if it is, the method can be blessed by the Commission. It's not yet done, I know this, but it's a methodology that we have studied, and for me, first sight could be something okay, but I cannot say this black and white, because it's something that we have, and auditors has to see if this methodology comply with our conditions.
The next question is, in frame of one project, if unit costs will be used, shall it be used for all centers in all countries? Or can the budget be estimated as a mixture of unit costs and real costs?
No, can be a mixture. They are not obliged to go all for unit cost.
So if I can add to that, it's even at two levels. So first, each center can use whether they want to use unit costs or not. You can have one center that uses unit costs and 10 that don't, or the other way around. And second, even at the level of a single center, you can choose some costs that are not included in your unit costs and others that are included. The only thing that you cannot do is cherry pick. If you do go for personnel costs, then all your personnel costs that are applicable to each patient must be unit costs. You cannot pick the more expensive doctors and bill them directly and the less expensive and bill them as unit costs. But you can decide, for example, perfectly that you do not want to include that you will bill the equipment directly because as actual cost, because that works fine for you, and the personnel costs you do as unit costs. But very important, the message, because this is a frequent misunderstanding, each beneficiary can choose their own method of reimbursement. It's not one and for all.
The next question would be, can we reimburse the travel costs of patients to the clinical center?
So
Good question, because it's in the commission decision. I do not have it here, but I think it was outside. I don't
exactly.
remember.
I think the unit commission, the commission decision says that it cannot be reimbursed as part of the unit cost, but it can of course be reimbursed as direct cost.
As direct cost.
Okay.
Outside the unit cost.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, if a deep freezer shall be bought for the clinical center, can the full price be reimbursed or only part of it?
Excuse me, if the question again, please.
If a deep freezer shall be bought for the clinical center, can the full price be reimbursed or only part of it?
No, of course, only part of this, because this is the how do you say amortization? Depreciation. So there are rules that are very clear in the annotated grant agreement, but one is depreciation, and the other one is time to be used in the project. This is because I said that when we think about timesheets, we are always thinking only about personal cost, but we have to have a sort of timesheets also for the use of machines, to know how long the machines are used in the project. Okay.
And the next questions are, costs of public hospitals also eligible for unit costs?
Oh, yes, if they follow the conditions, yes. It's not because they're public that we do not reimburse.
And how many Horizon 2020 projects in SC1 have already used unit costs in their projects?
I think, I don't have the latest counts, but I think it is around 4, 5, or 6 projects and a total of like 10 or 15 beneficiaries. So it's not huge, but we have some good examples.
And we think, and this is because I insisted in this interpretation that we can now ask this, the beneficiaries can ask during the life of the project for an amendment, is because what we heard about the problem for beneficiaries was not really a problem of unit cost, is that they thought that presenting this with the proposal, they were not ready at the time of the proposal to do all the calculations for a unit cost. Because has always been a single stage call for this. Yes, we have not done 2 stages. So, well, the most current problem was that they said that it was difficult for them to present it during in the proposal. So, but now we can accept an amendment for this at the beginning of the project, preferably. Hello? Hello?
Oh, can you hear us? Yes. So there, Constance. Okay, so just a second. There's a connection problem.
Okay,
from
yeah.
one of
But
the
we can
sides.
read ourselves.
Exactly.
Unless we.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we can't hear Constanze anymore, but we can read the question that she typed. So then,
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now yes.
Great. Good. Sorry. So I think it seems okay because everyone says they can hear. So the next question, should I read it?
Yes, please.
The next question would be that for one participant, she said our connection failed just when you said if the unit costs were applied on the individual basis, or does one unit cost apply to all beneficiaries?
No, again, they can choose. Each beneficiary can choose if they go to unit cost or actual cost.
And the next question would be: is expenses for clinical studies eligible also within an SME instrument proposal?
Very good question. We say the commission decision, I think, says that it applies to Societal Challenge 1. So now I don't know whether the SME instrument is still considered also as part of Societal Challenge 1? I don't think so. Now that it is completely bottom up, so then it would be, I don't know if they can do that on a voluntary basis. It's something that maybe we have to clarify afterwards and get back to the NCPs. We're not sure.
Okay. And the next question, it's again about the unit cost. So the question is, did I understand correctly that the unit cost definition must be identical for all partners and only costs differ, or can the definition also differ?
It's not, I don't know what do you mean by definition. What should be identical, we can go back to the slide here. Should be identical is the resources that they're going to be used. We said, for example, if for a blood test, we say 10 minutes of a nurse, for everybody should be the same, for all the beneficiaries. Then what it is different is the cost of this hourly rate for the nurses.
So we don't think it's very credible that in one hospital the nurse takes 10 minutes and in another hospital the nurse takes 20 minutes to take the blood. And also in every case you need a syringe and a cannula. We realize that in some cases there might be small differences. For example, in one country or hospital the nurse does the blood taking, in another one maybe the doctor does it. But that is so small a difference that we ask you to basically stick for that. Normally the resources should be identical. In that case, just go for one thing.
Agree among the beneficiaries and only one thing.
Okay, the next question would be, if the maximum budget for the action can cover only part of a clinical trial, do we need to demonstrate how the rest is going to be financed?
I think that's a general question so this doesn't, of course, influence your reimbursement method, but that is a question of the credibility of the proposal. And I think, yes, it helps and it will even usually motivate, and it's good information. If you say that you have additional financing for this study, that's fine, and you should outline that in the proposal, but not with a very high burden of proof. But what you need to be clear is, of course, which parts are financed by this other source of money and what you want to finance under other study. That should be clear in the proposal. Like, this is the part that we want you to reimburse, and here are other things that are going to be done by other people. And then you should say where this funding comes from, but not in huge detail. But what needs to be clear is that which part is it that our money is going to finance.
And also then when you declare cost, it should be very clear. We are going to pay the union contribution according to the cost you are declaring. So if you are declaring the cost of, I don't know, the clinical trial or the GMP production or whatever, you are declaring this cost. So we are going to reimburse according to this, because we are going to see the cost statements and we will reimburse. And if you have an audit, you will have an audit on those costs that you have declared to us. Not the cost you do not have declared. So it depends on how do you want to declare. You can declare everything, even if for example, imagine that the project is 10 million and you are going to spend and we are going to finance only 5 million is the maximum EU contribution. If you do like this, then if you declare the 10 million to us, you can do this. We will reimburse 5 million. We are not going to reimburse more. Then all the costs are auditable, 10 million. Then if you declare only 5 million, the 5 million are auditable, and the ones you are declaring. If you declare the 10 million, there's a part that is reimbursed by a third party, a donor, for example, Bill Gates, imagine. So you have to declare, in that case, the amount reimbursed by the donor as a receipt of the project. But this only if you declare this cost. If you don't declare the cost, you don't have.
Okay. So the next question asks, the template found in the call page we are applying is template for essential information to be provided for proposals including clinical trials, version 2 from June 28, 2017. So this has a structure which is different from what was presented in slides 1 to 15 today. So for instance, there are no numbered paragraphs in version 2 and it's also organized differently. The question is, can we use this version template or is there a new one? I guess.
So this is a very important question. I'm sorry if there was any misunderstanding or something. Can you tell us, maybe for us, which call topic you're applying to? And then I think the best thing we can do is to verify this afterwards, and maybe you can somehow, the HNN 2.0 can somehow put this information as an additional information after the where you also post the presentation. So we will clarify this version issue. I don't actually have a copy of the version here, so I will have to check what the correct version is. But if you also tell us which call topic you're applying to, then we will also double check on the participant portal, because there are indeed different versions.
And maybe just another general explanation to this. Yeah, well, I have not presented the sub-bullets of the high-level sections. So that might, the differences in how the template looks in contrast to my slides might come from this perspective, that I have only presented the high-level sections and not the sub-bullets. But the information given in the sub-bullets and the instructions in the template correspond to what I have mentioned during the presentation of my slides.
So that might indeed be the entire explanation for this. We're going to verify this, but I think the version of 2806/2017 is probably the correct one. We'll double check that.
Okay, so the topic seems to be strategic action supporting large-scale clinical trials, which is a Research and Innovation Action 2017.
But that doesn't sound like an SC1 topic. So what is the call number, the topic number of this? That is not, I don't think that is a call topic from Societal Challenge 1. Strategic action supporting large scale, that's...
Okay, so I think in the meantime we will just go on with the next question, which is similar to a previous question. Can the EU ICT project that develop, test, or validate medical devices can have eligible costs for clinical studies?
If this is Societal Challenge 1, then yes. So there are ICT calls also in Societal Challenge 1. Then legally, yes, it certainly can. But our colleagues will be surprised because they are not used to this in DG Connect. If it is not part of Societal Challenge 1, then in principle the unit costs are not applicable.
Okay. So it seems that, by the way, the topic strategic action supporting large-scale clinical trials is an EDCDP call.
Okay.
And the next question is, can there be more than one unit cost for clinical trials? So for example, there's a center that do MRI and others that do not do it. Should the unit costs be different?
So normally, normally the protocol should be the same in all recruitment sites. So I have difficulty imagining a clinical trial where in one center you do an MRI and in the other you don't. But if that is indeed the case, then you can simply leave out in your cost claim that the costs for that particular study. But I don't quite understand the situation
this particular task.
Yeah, you can leave out that particular task and leave out the costs.
Okay, so I think this was the last question so far. Is there any more question? Then please now, because I can see there's someone typing, but there's no question yet. Or maybe give them a minute. Oh, there it is. So the question is, does call SC1 DTH07 require the submission of this template?
No, that's a connect call, and it definitely is not required. And I think and it is not even possible to use that to use it for that call. So no.
Okay, thank you. So I think that was our last question. So thank you to our three speakers for giving the presentation and answering all the questions. Thank you to our participants. Yeah, I think it was a very, very interesting, very good webinar. So thank you.
thank you also from our side. Just maybe the one thing, when you later on post the presentation and the recording of this webinar, we will also post the clarification, the one or two additional clarifications. One was on the validity for the SME call topics, and the second one was about the correct version of the template. So those two things we will add as soon as this is online.
Okay, great.
And
Thank
thanks
you.
a lot to HNN 2.0, to Marta and to Constanze. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you too. And to all participants, it would be great if you could not just leave the webinar room now, but wait till I end the meeting in like 1 minute, and then you will be redirected to a very short feedback questionnaire. It would be great if you could give us feedback on the webinar. Okay, great. Thank you to all. Thank you, everyone. So I will now end the meeting. Bye.
Okay, bye. Bye.